If you haven't helped yourself to food at the back, please feel free. Get up any time. This is going to be, fairly informal, but make sure you get something to eat. I'm going to begin by introducing our guest tonight, Arthur Boers, who is the editor or author of about a dozen books addressing the intersection of faithfulness and daily life. Some of his award-winning publications include The Way is Made by Walking, A Pilgrimage Along the Camino de Santiago, Servants and Fools, A Biblical Theology of Leadership, Never Call Them Jerks, Healthy Responses to Difficult Behavior. And actually, I remember that book was part of our reading list in the congregational leadership course here at Knox when I was coming through with my MDiv, and it really helped me in my own pastoral ministry.
Charles was a friend of mine when I was writing that.
Oh,
students
right.
Together way back when.
Yes.
I'm the joke.
Learned a lot from him.
And the final book, Living into Focus, Choosing What Matters in an Age of Distractions, which is, I think, how we first bonded our love of Albert Boers, the philosopher. Let me just say a little bit more about Arthur here. He has a D.Min from Northern Baptist Theological Seminary and a Master of Fine Arts, his most recent degree, from Seattle Pacific, where I believe he wrote this book during an MFA program. He's an avid paddler by canoe, kayak, or paddleboard, an avid hiker having completed the Bruce Trail, a lover of Chicago blues, and an Anglican priest at St. Paul's Memorial in Scarborough, and I am proud to call him a friend. So thanks for coming tonight, Arthur. And,
Good afternoon. Thanks. Ryan is a very close friend of mine, so it's a pleasure to be here with him and with all of you. He's excited to teach here and teaching for a long time and is hoping to be a teacher. And so I'm just so pleased that he has an appointment here and he's with you. So I'm really glad to talk to you about this book, which is my favorite and best book. And yes, I say that almost every time I publish a book, but this time it's really true. I have been publishing books for about 30 years, over 30 years now. And about 20 years ago, I started to notice that there were authors that I really appreciated, not only for the quality of their insights, but because of the beautiful lyrical way that they had of writing. And I'd been writing pastoral theology, essentially, counseling, advice, whatever, about church life, conflict, jerks, whatever. But I really wanted to learn a new way of writing. And sometimes the genre is called creative nonfiction or literary nonfiction. And so I aspired to do a Master of Fine Arts in Writing, which I was able to do a few years ago. And I thought I would like to write about my childhood. I thought that would be worth exploring. And there were three things about my childhood that thought I would like to explore. First of all, I'm an immigrant kid. I was born here in Canada, but my parents were immigrants, and I was the oldest. So they didn't speak English at home. Dutch is my first language. And my parents, I was born in the 1950s, which was an era of great conformity. And my parents felt I should have a British name. And so they gave me the name Arthur. But the problem is the Dutch does not have the TH sound. So my parents could never pronounce my name. My mother still mispronounces my name. She just turned 90. And my dad mispronounced my name until the day he died. And it wasn't until kindergarten that I learned how to pronounce my own name. And the kindergarten teacher finally stuck her finger in my mouth to show me where my tongue should go to be able to say the TH. And I grew up in this Dutch Calvinist culture, and even though we didn't all live in the same area, we just hung around with Dutch people. So I went to a Dutch church. Everybody was Dutch: the minister, the members, the kids. I went to a Christian school. It was all Dutch. The students, teachers, they were all Dutch. The teachers didn't necessarily even have a bachelor's. We went to a Shell station for gas, and Shell is a Dutch corporation, and that franchise was owned by a member of our church, and we would pull up to the pumps, And other members of the church would pull up and we'd nod at them. It was like we were members of a secret society. And a block away from the Shell station was a Dutch credit union where I opened my first bank account. And besides the Dutch credit union was a Dutch store where you could buy droppies. Does anybody know what droppies are? These salted liquors. You could buy droppies. You could also buy underwear. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Canadians just can't make underwear the way Dutch people do. And the store behind the Dutch dry goods store was an electronics store where Mr. Van Dyke sold Philips, of course. Philips is another Dutch corporation. I bought my first tape recorder there. And we had a Dutch butcher, we had a Dutch baker, and if we needed a candlestick maker, I'm sure we would have found a Dutch one. Our electrician was Dutch, and his brother was our plumber, and they were both members of our church. So I grew up immersed in this Dutch culture. And I grew up as, sometimes missionary kids talk about being a third culture kid. They don't really know what culture they belong to, and that really describes me. I thought I wasn't Canadian, I'm Dutch. And then eventually I started visiting the Netherlands, and I realized, oh, I'm not Dutch either. And then I thought, well, I'm not Dutch, I'm not Canadian. Oh, well, I'm a citizen of the kingdom of God. That works for me. And that worked for quite a while, except then I moved to the States and lived there for 2 7-year stretches. And I realized, oh, I am Canadian. And it took me a long time. So I thought I'd like to explore that. I also wanted to explore my emerging faith because as a child already, I took Christian faith very seriously to the point that I even had some mystical experiences. And well, I'm in a Calvinist setting, right? Or some of you are Calvinists. Dutch Calvinism is not necessarily that friendly to mysticism, but I was already a mystic as a child. So I thought that would be worth exploring. And then the third thing is I wanted to explore the mystery of my father. My father was a brilliant man. He had a great education, but he was a fantastic businessman. He invented a form of greenhouses that were unique to North America. Eventually, his greenhouses got exported around the world, even to Holland. That was his great coup because Holland is the greenhouse capital of the world. And so he's a brilliant businessman, but he struggled with a number of things. He struggled with alcohol abuse and with addiction, and he had a violent temper, which focused on me a couple of times, and I now realize marked me for life. And so I thought, I'd like to write about the mystery about my father. I need to explore this mystery. So the book is really an exploration of all these things, but the more I wrote, the more I realized the main theme is the mystery of my father, relating to my father. And as I was writing this book, I realized, oh, he had PTSD, which is, of course, a term we didn't have when I was growing up, not something we were aware of. And then the more I worked on it, as I worked through things, I realized, oh, I have PTSD. PTSD helps explain why I've struggled with depression all my life. It explains nightmares that I've struggled with, a number of kinds of things. And so that was an important discovery and a liberating discovery, I would say, because I struggled a number of years with debilitating migraines that at times landed me in the emergency room, and those migraines have stopped. I don't know when the last time is that I have taken strong pain medication to manage my migraines. And I say that very reluctantly because I've heard a few too many unbelievable Christian healing stories, but it seems to be real. And the other thing is I connect that to emotional healing. And I think it has to do with the fact that I've worked through the PTSD stuff. And the other signal for me that may have been solved is I used to have a series of nightmares about bullies. I would have them regularly, and those nightmares have stopped. In fact, they stopped with one final episode, just like it was an HBO miniseries or something. I had one final dream, which I told Glenn about. Glenn and I often talk about dreams. I don't know how well you know Glenn, but he likes dreams. He likes to talk about Carl Jung. And I had this dream where there was this bully who, this time the bully just came up to my knees. And the bully kicked me in the shins, and it didn't hurt. And and there were two people standing beside me, and I just nodded. And I said, I have witnesses. And the bully was frustrated and then hit me in the stomach, and that didn't hurt either. And I just nodded and smiled, and I said, I have witnesses. And then the bully, I don't know how the bully did it because the bully only came up to my knees, but then the bully struck me in the face. And again, it didn't really hurt. And I just nodded and said, I have witnesses. And then the bully turned and ran. And this episode happened quite a while ago, and I haven't had any nightmares since. And when I told Glenn about that dream, he said, you know what's significant about that dream is that you have witnesses, that you have witnesses who've seen what happened. And that, in fact, is very important in terms of trauma and PTSD, because you don't just get PTSD from something awful happening to you. It's the sense of isolation and abandonment and not being understood. And to have witnesses, to have people stand with you, helps you move through that. And of course, the book also is a way of calling people to witness, right? To witness my experience. And recently, I spoke in St. Catharines. I was born in St. Catharines. And I remembered how when I was 7 years old, just a couple of miles from that bookstore, my father beat me into a blackout on the dining room floor. And then I woke several hours later. And I realized as I was speaking at that store, you know, I'm speaking on behalf of that 7-year-old. I'm being his witness. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, I'm not only speaking on his behalf, I'm speaking to him. I'm ministering to that 7-year-old in me. So that's where this book came from. A couple other things. It's called Shattered, which is, shatter is a very good verb. It's an onomatopoeia. I always love an excuse to say onomatopoeia. And it's not my title. You know, authors don't usually get their own titles. I wanted to call it All That Glass Shatters, a little more ambiguous, but I'll settle for this. One of the interesting things is a very common verb in trauma literature is shatter. I read a lot of trauma literature, and sometimes I just start circling how often it's used. And where this comes from is that the first thing that I remember about my dad was an act of violence, which involved shattering glass. And there's a lot of shattered glass in my life. My father built greenhouses, and in those days they were made of glass. And the glass would break, it would have to get picked up. My first job for my dad was picking up broken glass on construction sites. So there's a lot of glass in my life. A lot of it's broken. And you might not be able to tell, but this is kintsugi on the cover. Kintsugi is a Japanese art form when ceramics break, it's mended with precious metals. So there's a kind of a hopefulness to that. My family actually comes from a part of Holland called Glazenstad, which means the glass city. And the reason for that is it's so many greenhouses. I would visit my grandmother in Holland, and I would look out a second-story window, and I could see greenhouses for miles and miles and miles. And so glass really looms large in my family and in my family history, to the point that my grandfather, on my mother's side, he did not grow up in the Glazenstad, but he went there as a young agricultural apprentice. And he was working in greenhouses where they grew peaches, because Holland is too cold to grow fruit. So things that we think of growing outside, they grew inside. They grow grapes inside greenhouses, for example, and they grew peaches. And one thing that happened was a hailstorm swept through the area and obliterated a range of greenhouses. And my grandfather was really hungry. He was a poor agricultural apprentice. He didn't get much to eat where he had room and board, so he ate the peaches off the ground. And what he didn't realize was the peaches were needled with broken glass, and it caused terrible intestinal damage, which lasted for 30 years, 25, 30 years, until they came to Canada. And my mother made, I think, $20 a week when they came to Canada. They saved for a year to save up $1,000 to repair my grandfather's intestines. And for the rest of his life, he had these terrible scars all over his stomach from the surgery. So that's where the shattered comes from, and the glass imagery. So I'd like to read to you 2 chapters from the book. They're both relatively short. I'm an Anglican. So we have homilies, and our homilies go about 11 or 12 minutes. That's pretty good, don't you think? Oh, no, you probably like long sermons. But anyway, each reading is about 11 or 12 minutes. I'm going to read the very first chapter to kind of set things up and to give you a feel for what my childhood was like a little bit. And then I'm going to read the second last chapter, which is one of my favorite chapters in the book. It's about a man named Henry Nouwen. I'm sure some of you have read Henry Nouwen. And it's a hopeful chapter. There are good things that happen. And I read from the beginning and near the end for two reasons. One is I want you to know that it doesn't end on despair, that there is hope. There is transformation down the road. But I also have what's the word I'm looking for? Business-like is not the right word, but I have a mischievous reason. That is, I want to generate your suspense so that you hear the first chapter and then you hear the second last chapter and you go, well, how did he get from there to there? And try to get your curiosity going a little bit. And so I'll read from these chapters, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. I don't know if Glenn's interrogating me or facilitating a conversation. What's that?
We'll see.
That's that true. Okay, thanks. All right, chapter 1. Ow, you're hurting me are among the first words I remember, an oft repeated, all too familiar refrain. The complaint crept through the thin wall between their bedroom and mine, startled pain suddenly sparking from her tone, then clanging in my ears. I did not stay in bed or wish the sound away. I did not cover my head with my pillow to drown it out. I did not close my eyes, hoping to sleep. Instead, I felt called. I had a duty. I rose on the wobbly mattress, flannel giraffe pajamas damp from sweaty sleep, my hair mussed. I clambered over my crib rail, pivoted my torso across, and dropped to the hardwood. I ran out my door and into theirs, arms stretched high, crying, Superman! Bounding over the floor, I leaped onto the double bed that almost filled their room. Crawling over bunched sheets and prickly woolen blankets, squirming between my mom and dad, I pried apart their grappling. I felt no danger to myself, but I wanted my mother safe. They laughed at 3-year-old me. I don't laugh now. He manhandled her, poked her ribs and belly, twisted arms, tested limits, and my rush to intervene became a routine. Years passed before I realized their collusion. Sometimes they made early morning noise just to enjoy the pajama-clad toddler's rescue efforts. A great way to start the day, another hilarious family story. They meant no harm, they were just playing. Unable to distinguish protest from pretense, I joined their drama. Yet she did not always pretend. This was not always a game. On occasion, her tone rang pain-tinged, her voice rising, Ow, you're hurting me. Words twisted in excruciation. Failing to sort out aches from acting, I always reacted, certain I did the right thing. Rescuers, shining armor knights, steed-mounted cowboys, my namesake, King Arthur, deliver distressed damsels. Victims suffer a villain's dastardly deeds, and Dudley Do-Right sets things straight. TV, Tarzan, Robin Hood, the Lone Ranger, taught me scripts that I enacted over and again from my bedroom to theirs. My father regularly went off course, drinking too much, smashing a car and forgetting how it happened, exploding with expletives, and my mother would recruit another man in the family, her father or his uncle, to talk to Plein. Papa would straighten out for a time, but the reform never lasted, and eventually I would be tapped to intervene. No doubt that contributed to my formation later as a pastor, perpetually looking out to rescue others. In our small apartment on Martindale Road, I admired the Indonesian batik draped on the living room wall. Eventually, I would learn that my father brought that back from his military service. a time measured in months that burdened him with 40+ years of sweat-drenched nightmares. Below the colorful fabric squatted a gray couch. Kitty corner from the sofa was a matching chair. I ran toy cars along the upholstery, creating curving roads from the warp and weft, soft mountains out of armrests and cushions. Resting atop a shelf, a light brown starfish, knobbly and dried, leaned against the wall. For years, I would assume it came from nearby Lake Ontario, where we occasionally went to the beach. A geranium in a clay pot given by a local greenhouse farmer sat on our pine coffee table, as did a stubby brown bottle of old Vienna beer sweating beside it. A multicolored glass bowl was also on the table, often filled with Macintoshes. That bowl always on display wherever we lived until it and I were shattered on the same day 12 years later. A wide ashtray collected my father's Buckingham butts and a cigarette package with royal-looking gold and scarlet coat of arms perched on the edge, greenery sprouted on windowsills. The potted geranium, leaves and flowers trembling, hurtled toward the picture window, moist dirt drifting down, sprinkling onto the carpet. I watched without surprise. I already knew that such things happened in our house. My mother ducked. The pot passed her and struck the pane, the bump, at first hardly audible. The surface gave slightly, shimmering and reverberating, a softly tinkling cymbal, then spidered suddenly in all directions. Chiming splinters hailed down, large shards wobbled and dropped, some impaled the floor inside and the lawn 2 floors down outside, others shattered as they fell to wood and earth. The plant continued its angry alfresco arc before abruptly plummeting from sight. And once objects stopped moving and the pane ceased disintegrating, when no more glass fell, I heard robins and trees and cars passing a block away. Cool air, hinting of spring thaw, seeped around. Scents I encountered often over the following years in many greenhouse visits. I was there. Only 3. What could I understand? Glass breaks. I learned that early, but no one told me that smashing windows is outlandish, a troubling, dangerous infraction of civility, family life, simple good sense, thrift, safety. I remember nothing about their argument, points scored, insults lodged. Picturing this now, I see my parents as I knew them later, middle-aged or older, and certainly ought to know better. Doing the math, I realized that she was 27 and he 33, both of them younger than my own adult children. I could be the father of these troubled, immature parents. At half my present age, my parents had already endured more trauma, danger, and loss than I will ever know. They witnessed lives taken by Nazis in their neighborhood, and they feared their own apprehension. They suffered the deprivations of economic collapse, weathered their own parents' violence, and gave up almost everything when they immigrated to Canada from the Netherlands. They were only allowed to bring 1 crate of goods for the family, and $50 per person to this foreign country where they could not speak the language and were insulted as displaced persons and frequently told to go back to where you came from. They knew about trying to survive, not the luxury of dwelling on feelings, their own or others. Over the years, my family talked about this incident with the pot of geraniums, and Papa never showed embarrassment or remorse about this or any other tantrum, and did not have to explain, let alone apologize. And in each recounting of the window breaking, both parents again and again agreed on the most amusing aspect. As that plant hurtled past my mother, I taunted, inspired no doubt by the Three Stooges, a show my father and I enjoyed together. Yeah, you missed her. In some tellings, I even stuck out my tongue and blew a raspberry at him. Whenever the memory of the shattered window came up, they always laughed and concluded with my wisecrack. After his outburst, my father left others, my mother, employees, eventually my sister and me, to pick up literal and figurative pieces. Hurled objects were never his responsibility. Other people or circumstances were to blame for his rage. Someone else could make amends, as my mother often did. This time too, safety demanded that she clean up right away, carefully sweeping with dustpan and broom, and then vacuuming finer fragments. She warned us to avoid the area near the window, especially in socks or bare feet. And for months afterwards, she found errant, unexpected slivers stuck in carpet fibers, randomly sparkling in the sunlight. And reputation required that she get out to the yard soon, retrieving sharp shards, not to mention the smashed pot and broken plant, quickly, so the neighbors did not see, did not know, did not figure out that Plen lost his temper again. I could not yet articulate what I was beginning to learn. Men explode dangerously. No one is safe around my dad. Be wary. Wiser to stay on the far side of the room. Sometime it might be me on the receiving end, and with practice, he would not miss. I have always noticed glass, paid attention to it. One relative ate it, as I explained to you earlier, although not on purpose, badly damaging his intestines. My father used it in his work, repairing and building greenhouses. He bought it wholesale to sell to greenhouse farmers, and when angry, he flung and smashed it. At home, we stored and sold it. As a teenager, I unloaded, moved, and stacked bulky 75-pound wooden crates, kists in Dutch, filled with glass panes, from manufacturers' transport trucks into our storage, or into customers' vans, or onto pickups for delivery to construction sites. Kist is Dutch for crate, chest, or box. It can also mean casket, or coffin. The cheap wood put splinters in my palms and blisters on my fingers. The works taxed my muscles and had to be done carefully. Unwieldy cases bore the label fragile contents, and I wore steel boots to prevent my toes getting crushed. All that expletive glass. As an Anglican priest, I intone at funerals, earth to earth, ashes to ashes. George Herbert, another Anglican priest, in his poem, Church Monuments, wrote that flesh is but the glass which holds the dust. Glass is made from sand, a form of earth, and combined with ashes. Sometimes it forms naturally when lightning strikes beaches. And perhaps observing that long ago gave people the idea. Glass manufacturing goes back more than 5,000 years. Ancient Romans already had glass windows. Glass is central to our lives. Windshields and windows, telescopes and test tubes, binoculars and bulbs and barometers, microscopes and mirrors and magnifiers, lights and lenses, preserving jars and prisms, jewelry, vases, stained glass, chandeliers, crystal goblets. Glass improves vision for the short and farsighted. With my first pair of glasses at age 10, green blotches above my head and below my feet resolved into discrete tree leaves and distinct grass blades. Thousands and 10,000s of them. I had no idea until then. And glass sparks our imagination. Cinderella's Sleeping Beauty's kissed, warnings against living or throwing stones in glass houses. We read the glass castle, the glass menagerie, the glass key, and of course, Through the Looking Glass. From TV, I knew about glass eyes, often a villain's disfigurement, and in fights, one hoped for the happy prospect of an enemy's glass chin. When I was a young adult, the band Blondie introduced A Heart of Glass, and the Apostle Paul writes that now we see through a glass darkly. In Arthurian legends, my namesake disappeared into Avalon, the Isle of Glass, and Merlin was trapped in a glass house or glass cavern. Glass can connote peril. The broken windows theory suggests that shattered panes adversely affect urban crime rates. And as a teen, I read of November 1938, when Nazis attacked Jewish businesses, storefronts, homes, and synagogues, an event called Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass. because of smashed panes littering streets and sidewalks. On my far smaller scale, fractured glass felt personal. I learned wary attention. And then chapter 23. In my mid-30s, 2 decades after the last time my father beat me, and 2 years after he died, I broke glass twice in 1 week. Once for the first time in my life, in anger. On a September Saturday atop a stepladder, I was scraping the peeling wood around a garage window, preparing it for painting later that month. I thought about long to-do lists at home with our small children and at the rural church that I pastored, which was suddenly attracting newcomers who squeezed our small space, not to mention our comfort zone. In a couple of hours, I was to head to a Christian education conference where I would give a workshop on spirituality. Plus, this window needed work. On top of it all, I was to leave for a 5-day retreat in 48 hours. Overwhelmed by an impossibly long list of duties that was complicated by my upcoming trip, a cloud of steamy mist descended into my brain and swirled behind my eyes. I grunted in frustration and plunged my fist against the window, startled by how little resistance the glass offered, how easily it fractured, like the thinnest ice. I could have pushed my fist through, no punch necessary. The cascade of jagged accusers clattered to the ground. I felt relief that I had not cut myself, as such an injury would be hard to explain, especially to congregants. I fetched a broom and dustpan from the kitchen. And as I stepped back into the garage, my mother pulled up. She had just completed the 90-minute drive for a prearranged weekend visit. She saw the broken window and scattered glass. I averted my face from her. "Is it, we're so?" she asked. "Is it happening again?" She remembered my father. With nothing to say, I finished cleaning up the debris, then went in, showered, changed into good clothes, and put on a tie. I drove to the conference held in a local high school gym where Sunday school teachers listened to me claim that prayer can de-stress our lives. The irony was not lost on me even then. On the way home, I stopped at a hardware store and spent the day's honorarium on a replacement pane that the proprietor cut to size, along with a can of gray putty, glazing nails and putty knife. Back home, placing and securing that window, I remembered that my father glazed for years, but never repaired his own rage-inflicted destruction. On Monday, I went to stay with Henry Nouwen, a priest whose books had influenced my prayer life and ministry. He resided an hour's drive away, just north of Toronto at daybreak in Richmond Hill, part of L'Arche, a worldwide network of communities where people with developmental and intellectual challenges live with their assistants. I had interviewed Nouwen for a magazine several years earlier and then visited a couple times. And now he would guide me on a 5-day retreat. He told me that duration was quite short, and it was the longest retreat I'd ever taken. I could not imagine a longer one given home and church responsibilities. I knew Henry was speaking at a nearby seminary, so, as expected, when I arrived at his house, no one was there. I let myself in and found my room and was welcomed by a warm note and a vase of bright sunflowers that testified to his love for Van Gogh. Minutes later, he phoned, apologizing for not being there for my arrival. I was glad to hear his familiar Dutch accent, the one that consoles and reassures me. He said he had given me the best room. That first evening, through my open door, he saw me reading and he said, "You better get a nice lamp. This one is so awful." He went down the hall and in a minute showed up with a lamp that he'd retrieved from his room. A while later, he returned, handing me a CD player and discs, Bach's Brandenburg Concertos, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Mozart's symphonies, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and he told me, "Play these as loud as you like. I won't mind." Every day we met twice for an hour to discuss scripture passages that he assigned for my meditation, insisting I use his Jerusalem Bible. And pondering those texts, my week's mantra emerged from Mary's Magnificat, the Almighty has done great things for me. We ate breakfast together, and later in the day drank tea that he prepared. And once we went to a cozy Austrian restaurant nearby. The proprietors knew him well. Our meal, tender red cabbage simmered in apples, nutmeg and cloves, sour braten with sweetly tangy gravy, followed by strong coffee with real whipping cream, reminded us both of Dutch cooking. On my second day, we went to his office, and at the front of the Daybreak property, he showed me shelves of his published books. Just take whatever, he said. And he gave me 3 copies of the Dutch translation of his prodigal son book, Eindelijk Thuis, which means finally home, the title naming a yearning that both he and I shared. Another evening, he arrived back at the house around 10 p.m. I was in a chair, illuminated by his lamp, reading with my feet propped on the bed. He sat down on the mattress and gave my legs a friendly pat, and we each reviewed our day for the other. Henry explained to me that he'd made sure his calendar that week had plenty of space for our conversations. I knew this was no small thing given his responsibilities and long to-do lists. Why, I asked, when he had so many other commitments, and he told me, we've built up a relationship and know each other. You have the stamina to do your thing without being intrusive or demanding. I thought about that, saying nothing, and then he added, by the way, I don't want you to pay Daybreak anything for this stay. You are here as my friend. All week, I struggled with whether to tell him about that window. It felt ridiculous and humiliating. Plus, every time I came to Daybreak, I seemed to be in crisis. During my first visit, an hour-long interview turned into a day-long conversation, and Henry, addressed my evident distress toward the end of our time together, he pulled a chair near and he leaned toward me, explaining, you have a tender heart. This means that God is calling you to a deep spiritual life. Tenderness can destroy you because you can just be pulled apart, burn out, and the whole thing. But you can also be a mystic, and that's what you obviously have to be. I asked, what does that mean? And he said, to be a mystic, I don't mean anything more than that God is the one who loves you deeply. And that's what you have to trust. And keep trusting, keep trusting, keep trusting. On this most recent visit, I evasively summarized my recent days of feeling once again overloaded and stressed. I couldn't bear to confess the broken glass, even when he said, our time together will be helpful, only if you are completely honest. Each morning we prayed with the Carmelite breviary. I kept losing my place in the book, and Henry helped me find the way. After the formal prayers, we sat for 30 minutes of silence. He concluded our time by kneeling and stretching out his hands and reciting aloud from memory Charles de Foucault's prayer. Father, I abandon myself into your hands. Do with me what you will. Whatever you may do, I thank you. I am ready for all. I accept all. Let only your will be done in me and in all your creatures. I wish no more than this, O Lord. Into your hands I commend my soul. I offer it to you with all the love of my heart, for I love you, Lord, and so need to give myself, to surrender myself into your hands without reserve and with boundless confidence, for you are my Father. Amen. After morning prayers, we breakfasted on buttered rye toast and thin Gouda slices. I had brought him a Dutch cheese plain as a gift, and Henry boiled milk for our coffee. We chatted, aware that within the hour, large community members and assistants would arrive for Mass in that house. At one breakfast, Henry told me that I needed to make my ministry more Eucharistic, but I had no idea what he meant. Our church celebrated the supper only a few times a year. I didn't ask for clarification, though. I felt I should know what he intended. Later that day, he gave me a manuscript of a forthcoming book with burning hearts, a meditation on the Eucharistic life. From it, I learned that in the Eucharist, Jesus takes us, blesses us, then breaks us, and finally gives us into ministry. At the end of Thursday's breakfast, Henry stood. I need to make a quick phone call, he said. And then he paused. Oh, can you clean these for me? He gestured toward 2 simple glass candle holders on the counter. streaked by discolored wax that had dripped and accumulated along the sides. Sure, ik moet iets doen for the cost. I have to do something for my room and board. One at a time, I held each holder over the garbage bin. And with a butter knife, I pried and scraped away large chunks. Then I removed remaining bits with my thumbnail. Finally, I filled the dishpan with warm water and immersed the first, scrubbing and setting it aside on a kitchen towel before doing the same for the second. Drying them, I was shocked to see cracks in one. But how? I thought I had handled them carefully, set them down gently. Had the fracture been there before and I overlooked it? Surely I would have noticed. Is this how I repay Henry's hospitality? What would he say? He cherished nice things. Cheryl, a community assistant, wandered through the kitchen. Look, I told her, somehow this cracked, and I don't know whether I did it, but I feel bad. Still, they're simple. They can't be worth much. Unfortunately, she said, they are. A famous glass blower in Vermont custom made them for Henry. My stomach tightened over this mishap. I worried about his disapproval or worse. I could hardly sit still as I waited. Minutes later, he burst into the kitchen, hurrying to get to the basement. Wait, Henry, I have to show you something. Okay, but I don't have much time. I must get ready. The service is in a few minutes. I'm not sure what happened, Henry, whether I did it or not, but one holder is cracked. I'm sorry. I thought I was careful. Henry grew very still, no longer in a rush. He looked toward the counter, picked up and turned the glass stem in his hands, studying the damage. I waited, fretting about his reaction. Would he scold and tell me about its value, its specialness, its uniqueness? Would he question whether I was careful enough? Would he lament the loss of something precious and valuable? Would he raise his voice? Would this ruin even end my visit, perhaps all future visits? And would he ask, as my father often did, what's wrong with you? Oh, Arthur, he said, for his accent, like my father's, always mispronounced my name. It's okay, don't worry. Pulling me from my kitchen chair, his long arms swept me into a bear hug, tight against his chest. Full body contact. I could count each bony finger pressed into my back. And seconds later, he released me and then disappeared, descending noisily to the basement chapel, bouncing down the wooden steps. All went so fast that I hardly knew what had happened. I went to brush my teeth, hoping to calm myself. And then I too hustled down the stairway planks. I settled into the gentle sway of an IKEA armchair, one where I had meditated on scripture texts every morning and afternoon that week. Assistants and members arrived, unwrapping blankets, positioning wheelchairs, murmuring encouragements, arranging large pillows for contorted bodies, massaging backs and shoulders. I knew what to expect. Informal Eucharistic liturgy, simple songs that involved and included people with severe handicaps, some of them periodically moaning. I would savor Taizé chants and the upcoming Homi and holy worship. I looked at the slow-slung altar, made of highly polished wood and shaped like a boat and ark, a safe haven in turbulent times. It had been commissioned by Henry for this very space. And from behind it, Henry, in white alb and emerald stole, flung his arms right and left, embracing the gathering and calling, "The Lord be with you." My eyes ran to and fro at his ambidextrous invitation and were drawn to the candles. The holders, each bearing one lit taper, stood at attention on either end of the altar, and studying the small sentinels, I could no longer see where the break might be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arthur. I was thinking at this point we could just do some informal questions. And I have so many questions about this book. Should I sit down? Maybe I'll sit up. Okay, yeah. The first question I have, Arthur, just to sort of lead things off, is there's so much talk today about post-traumatic growth. In other words, the psychotherapeutic literature is seeing trauma as an amazing opportunity. The more we can work with our trauma and pay attention to these wounds that we've experienced, the more it opens opportunities to make us, more vulnerable, better therapists, more aware of relational realities. The Jungians like to say that the power is in the wound, but you have to work with that wound. So anyway, my question is about the spiritual realities that sort of inform your process of growth. Like, how did the presence of God or mystical experiences influence your healing?
Okay, so there are a lot of things, a lot of directions I could go on. I'll just tell you one vignette, and then if you want to ask more, you can, or other people can ask questions. So I mentioned that I was a mystic already as a child, and one of my experiences happened in my bedroom when I was 14 years old. And what you need to understand is this was right around the last time that my father beat me. He beat me, he knocked me down, kicked me, and I got up and he beat me. I smiled and tried to calm him down. He said, "Oh, you think this is funny?" So he beat me more, knocked me down and kicked me again. And then he lifted and smashed that bowl I mentioned in the first chapter, and the apples went fly. And then he pummeled me with apples for a while. So it was a pretty horrifying experience. And that was about 14 feet, maybe 16 feet from where I slept from my bed. And on a Good Friday, I felt particularly convicted of my sin on the Good Friday evening. It had been a very somber service, of course. During the day I prayed at great length about my sins, because my sins had put Jesus on the cross. And my sins when I was 14 mostly had to do with fantasies about tight sweaters and short skirts, stuff like that. And, I wanted to stop that. I promised God I would stop that. And I was laboring with that and kind of berating myself over and over. And while I was doing that, I saw the ceiling slide open. The ceiling in my bedroom overhead slid open. And I saw two figures, two bearded men. I'm not saying this is theologically appropriate or correct or fully orbed, but it was two bearded men who were clearly father and son, and they were smiling at me. And it was a very powerful vision because it kind of counterbalanced other things in my life. So one thing it was, to see this loving, affectionate relationship between a father and a son marked a real contrast. I mean, I loved my father, but it was a complicated relationship. So it marked a contrast there. But I also felt they were inviting me into communion with them. Do you know that famous icon, the Rublev icon of the Trinity? There's three angels around a table, and there's one part of the table is open, and that icon is inviting us into community. Well, that's what I felt in this vision. And what I realized in retrospect is that the vision didn't help me overcome my fantasies for once at all. I can't claim that. But what the vision did was it gave me a new way of understanding God, invited me into a new understanding of God and a new relationship with God. Because until then, really, as children do, especially boys, I had conflated my idea of God the Father with my own father. And I perceived this angry being up in heaven who could bash me for reasons that I don't understand, and that I always had to be on guard. And so it was a way of kind of liberating me. So I think that's one place where my mysticism helped me. I think mysticism always needs to be tested and discerned. But in my case, I think this thing was fruitful. There are other gifts. I was talking to a priest recently. We have several priests on the staff where I am a priest, and was a couple of years ago, at the last minute, I was dealing with some of my PTSD stuff, and I couldn't preach. I was supposed to preach, and at the last minute, I bailed, and this other priest bailed me up. So I saw him a couple weeks later, and I said, "Well, thanks so much for doing that for me." He said, "Yeah. Well, what's happened? Were you under the weather? Did you have a bug?" I said, "Well, I'm struggling with PTSD." I said, "Oh, I have no idea." And so we talked about that for a while, and then I said to him, "One of the things that PTSD means is that I basically feel emotional pain every day. I live with that every day." And he said, "Oh, I had no idea." And he said, "Arthur," he's a really good pastor. He said, "Arthur, I don't want to downplay the pain that you feel, but I do think that this might be one of the reasons why you're a good pastor." And so there's something about, what did you say? The healing is in the wounds, the ministry is in the wounds, right? And I do, it's been interesting to read, to write this book, to see where, like, I felt a call to ministry at age 4, but I also see a number of other places in this book that led me to ministry. So one was this unhealthy pattern of triangling that I mentioned at the beginning. But another one would be that I did have really great pastors when I was a kid. They were all men back then. And they were really good models that inspired me to be a pastor. And in some ways, I feel like I'm only discovering and understanding this recently. I did all kinds of family of origin, family systems work in the 1930s when I was hanging around with Charles. 1930s. And when I was in my 30s, that's when I was hanging around with Charles. We were in the same pastoral counseling program. And, I thought I was done. Essentially, I thought I was done. And it was important work. It was good work. I'm glad I did it. But, I realized in the last decade, I still have more work to do.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
Thank you. Thanks. We were just talking today in my class about trauma. So, and a lot of my students are here, but let's just open this up to questions. If anyone has questions for Arthur, now's your chance.
There's a hand in the back already.
I have like 10, but I'm just gonna ask the first one. What kind of, I don't want to bring your sister into this. I'm just curious, did she also struggle?
What's that?
Did she also struggle?
My father never hit my sister, so just to free you up from that fear.
Okay, so that's actually, it goes into the second question, which I see a lot.
First one was easy.
Yeah, I see a lot of like immigrant families go through.
Yes.
Which is where the boy is the partner and the boy with the girl.
That's right.
And so I wonder how she's impacted. And I also wonder if, you've made a clear choice to heal.
Yeah.
Some don't.
That's right.
Some will never forgive their fathers.
That's right.
And so in a therapy, like kind of sessions where you're trying to help, but they won't forgive, they won't make that choice. No, they deserve justice. And so there's a resistance to forgiveness, or the choice to heal through whatever methodology. What would you like? Obviously you can't fix or you can't force them. But what would be a good advice to just let them like encounter this on a different level, or?
Okay. So I'm not a therapist, so but I'll make a couple observations. So one is my sister died when she was 17.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, and she was my only sibling. So she never had, and she never got hit. So, she never had the time or whatever to process it.
Right.
There were a lot of expectations on me as the oldest child. I was expected to go into my dad's business, for example.
Yeah.
And I write about that, how I was freed from that. And the other thing I wanted to say was, I'm giving these talks on many places, and a lot of immigrants or children of immigrants are saying there's parallels for them.
Yeah, I'm a child. I'm an immigrant. Like I'm a child of
You too,
immigrant.
yeah.
I had I'm the sister.
Okay.
So I grew up in that same kind of context.
Yeah.
Thankfully, my brother has chosen to forgive.
Okay.
However,
Yeah.
we are surrounded by families from the same culture that some of the men do they're not forgiven.
Right.
And so the relationship is kind of like separate.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to tell you was that at one of my book events, I used to teach at Tyndale, and one of my former students showed up. She was a really good student. She had great vocabulary. I remember that. I really liked her vocabulary. And, she showed up and she said, Arthur, I've been a therapist for 10 years and a supervisor. So she really got some impressive chops. And she said, my expertise is second generation Canadians and intergenerational trauma. And your book is sparking all kinds of stuff that I can relate to. So that felt good. But here's the thing. Her name's Frances. She's 30 years younger than I am. And her mom was a refugee from the People's Revolution, what's called the Cultural Revolution in mainland China, brutal time. And her father was a political refugee from Hong Kong. So I thought, this is fascinating. She's from a completely different generation and different political and cultural realities. And what I say, speaking into her circumstance, and vice versa. So she and I actually have been doing workshops together. We've been going around, and it's a lot of fun. A couple weeks ago, a child of Hungarian refugees came and talked to me. So a lot of people are comparing notes that there are many things that feel quite familiar. So I just wanted to say that the way you were nodding at me as I read, I had a feeling that you could relate.
Second
to some of the
generation,
things.
yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. Glenn is more of an expert in therapy, certainly compared to me, and but I think to be stuck in unforgiveness is a really limiting and restrictive place that in the end harms us more than it harms anybody else. And but people need to be heard. They need to be listened to, and sometimes they have to talk for a long, long time. I don't know if I don't. Do you have any follow-up that you want to?
Yeah, that makes sense. No, it makes sense. Sometimes, and I feel that, like, so I've seen it because I'm directly exposed to it.
Yeah.
Is the anger is there for years, and
Yeah.
even though they're just repeating the same stuff, they just need to feel heard all the
Yes.
time.
Yeah.
I guess my heart just goes out because, people are in their, 50s and 60s and they still stuck
Yeah.
in the things that
Yeah.
30 years ago have happened. And I guess I'm just trying to all I could do is, listen.
Yeah.
Right, and I guess that would be what Glenn would tell me to do.
So I'll say a couple other things, and one is, when I don't know how to pray for people, I just visualize open hands as if they were God's hands, and I just visualize the person in God's hands. And I just say, Lord, give them what they need. Because I don't know what it is. I don't know what I don't have to tell God, I don't know. I'm just telling you now.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but that's how I try to pray a blessing for people.
Thank you.
Another thing I would say is it's really important to give permission to talk, give people permission to talk about this. And so as a pastor in sermons, I talk about abuse, and that opens up space for people to talk to me. Same thing with my book. The church that I'm part of, I've been there for 14 years, over 14 years. Most of the congregation are immigrants. I thought I knew people well. And after they've read the book, now they're talking to me about their childhoods. A lot of them are in their 70s and 80s. And the other thing that I've noticed, and this has happened a lot, I've been in it happened just this past Sunday. I was in a Christian Reformed church, a Dutch Calvinist church. And after the service, a man came to me, looked to be in his 70s or 80s, as a retired school principal. And he said, Arthur, I've read your book twice. I'm like, thinking to myself, wow, twice. It only came out in May. You read it twice. I didn't even know how he heard of the book. He said, I read the book twice. And he said, it just reminded me of so much about my own childhood and my own father, and how my father wouldn't talk with me about these things. And he started to cry. And I don't know how many men in their 70s and 80s I've seen now at book events who talk to me and start to cry about, the wounds that they suffered, how their father won't talk to them, how this grief is still there. And so, I'm hoping that my book gives permission to talk about these hard things. And, lots of times our families don't want us to talk about these things. And I have pushback from some of my relatives who, they're like, okay, well, maybe you need to do that for your healing, but don't publish it, don't tell other people. And I relatively said, well, you make it sound like you were abused. And I'm like,
I was.
beaten into a blackout. I think that qualifies as abuse. So anyway, so we need to give people permission. I see your hand, there was a hand here already. So what are you next?
Mine
Oh, I thought you had a hand.
or hers?
You addressed this a little bit already when you mentioned your sermons. But I'm wondering, as a pastor,
Yeah.
how you bring your own understanding and experience with violence and abuse into the congregation and how you address congregants. Because churches as a whole, I have some intimate experience with Dutch Calvinist churches. Oftentimes, there's some lack of understanding or even resistance when some of these things come forward, and leadership, pastors, consistories, sometimes there's a tendency to go quickly to reconciliation and forgiveness before examining safety, repentance, accountability. And I feel like when we have men particularly who understand these issues, it can change some of those dynamics. And I'm wondering how that plays out for you as a pastor in your congregation.
Pretty general question. I'm not quite sure.
Okay, so have you been able to institute any policies or protocols so that if you are made aware of abuse within homes of congregant members that have maybe they're being addressed in different ways than they were previously, or in places where there isn't an understanding of some of the dynamics of intimate partner violence?
Yeah, so in the Anglican Church, we have all kinds of protocols about abuse. We take it very seriously. So it's not so much that I need to help initiate protocols. Plus, I'm not an incumbent. I'm not a lead pastor anymore. I used to be, not anymore. But I do believe in opening up the conversation. I have worked with abused people and abusers, and I am convinced that this is long, hard, careful work, but it needs to be taken seriously. And I don't believe in counseling people towards false and quick reconciliation. And I have at times counseled women just to leave them in, to be safe, to keep their children safe. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At the very least, I think there's more people with that perspective who are needed, is my personal
Oh,
opinion.
okay. All right. Thanks. I'll take that as an affirmation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the work that you're doing.
You had a question?
Yes, I just wanted to know if, so you.
Just a little louder for my old ears.
Okay, all right. So your abuse started when you were very young, right?
My what started?
Your abuse.
Yes.
Was there a point in your youth
Yeah.
when you felt like you hated your father? And if you did, how did you get past that to loving him?
I never felt that I hated my father.
Was that a cultural response, or was that just a genuine connection from you to him?
Well, I think children are naturally loyal to their parents, and they think their parents are the norm. They're the standard. So I actually never questioned my dad either. I actually questioned those instances because I would say, I hadn't done anything wrong that day. And then my dad would say, well, you probably did something wrong some other time, which is a crazy making answer. But I didn't question it. I didn't question things. And also, many of my friends had fathers who were far more abusive than mine. So I thought, in some ways, they had it pretty good. And it took me a long time to wrestle with the implications of this abuse, that it was abuse. When I started calling it abuse, but it's relatively recent. And I did all this family systems work in the 1930s, and I looked at the triangling and why I became a pastor and all kinds of stuff. But I never really thought much about the abuse. It was only in the last 10 years. And part of it was I would tell people stories about my childhood and their jaws would drop and they would look shocked. And I'm like, oh, apparently there's something shocking about what I'm telling you, and I didn't know it was shocking. So it's an awareness that emerged very gradually. Okay? My friend who looks like another friend.
We live in the same community. That's why I look familiar in
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
I lived over St. Paul's, which is down the street from my house.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, nice, nice.
So that's why we see you around. I had a question about, during these interactions, I know you said you had early experience with mysticism, right? And I can see that maybe pushing you towards, I guess, a faith-driven life, right?
Yeah.
But I can also see that being directed in a form of like hate and anger and pushed away from religious life altogether.
Yeah.
And I was curious if you ever came across that experience for yourself, or whether that mysticism experience really formed that bond for you.
If the mysticism.
Experience formed that bond for you to God.
Yes, I'm not completely sure what you're getting at, but I do think that the mysticism helped me to find a new relationship with God and a new image of God. And that was a very liberating thing. It never did lead me to anger and hatred. Is that your question?
Yeah, I was curious, like you're saying, some forms of abuse, if you related also to the experience of a father and a son, but what you were experiencing wasn't that. So I can see how someone else might see that as, you know, becoming angry at it, right?
Yeah.
And turning away from God altogether, as opposed to, you know, going towards him. Like, I think we were talking about this earlier, the why me question, right? Like, why me, right? So,
Yeah. There are, I had moments where I got angry at my dad. I remember that. Yelling at him in the Tel Aviv airport in Israel one time, really loud. So I had outbursts that I had to deal with at times, but there was not a kind of a long lingering sense of anger. There were just moments when I exploded. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
kind of. I was more curious about if you ever directed it towards God. As
Oh,
opposed
okay.
to anywhere
All
else.
right, so I've had my struggles with God, especially around when my sister died. I was 20, she was 17, had a very naive Christian faith, and I didn't know what to do with that. That such a good and innocent person could die, and we could suffer and grieve so much. And that was a major shift in my faith. And I almost became an atheist. One morning in logic class, I was sitting in the back of the class, and I remember philosophy class, and I was sitting in the back row. It was a few weeks after my sister died, and I thought, you know what? I don't believe in God. Maybe there is a God, but if God can do this kind of thing, I don't want to believe in God. And I left the class. I snuck out. The door was to the back. I snuck out. I thought, okay, I'm an atheist. I've been a Christian all my life, but I'm an atheist now. Trying that on for size. I walked up the hill to the library. And before I got to the top of the hill, I remembered that C.S. Lewis used to say, Jesus made outlandish claims. And given the claims he made, he must either be a liar or a lunatic or who he said he was. And I've heard people criticize that, but you know what? It made sense to me. And by the time I got to the top of the hill, I thought, well, you know, I like Jesus. And I'm going to stick with Jesus. I don't know what to make of God the Father. I don't know what to make of Old Testament, but I like Jesus. And for a few years, I just read the Gospels. I just thought about Jesus. And then eventually, I kind of got reintroduced to a broader take on faith. So I've had my struggles and arguments with God, but I was never angry at God for these kind of things that happened. There was a question way at the back a while ago, right?
Yeah, so that's kind of blowing my mind a little bit. Like your story is like, this is my story.
Your story?
Yeah. To a large degree, like even I'm an immigrant, the stuck between two countries thing. And
Yeah,
I remember the first time I went back home and I was like, oh, I don't belong to either place, right?
right, exactly.
But I'm wondering, dealing with the PTSD, you said, if I'm remembering right, that you discovered it while you wrote the book.
Yeah.
So what was that like? I mean, what was it like before that? Do you think that subconsciously or something you knew that that's why you had to write the book? And what was it like writing it as you were discovering
Yeah,
that
well,
this is what happened, right?
Sorry?
That this is what happened, because I assume part of it was that you were just like, well, this didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way I remember it, or something like that, right?
So, yeah, I think you're right that unconsciously I knew I needed to write about this. I thought I was just gonna write a book about my childhood, because I thought it's kind of interesting. You know, make these jokes about being Dutch and people laugh and not being able to pronounce my name. I thought, oh, that'd be fun, that'd be interesting. And I know that my mystical stuff was kind of unusual, so I thought, yeah, I'd write about that. But it was only, it was kind of very gradual. So I looked more and more at my dad, and my mom said, he acted so crazy at times, we didn't know what to do with him. And then at some point she said, I think he had PTSD. And I realized, of course, he had PTSD, which was not something we knew about or talked about back then. And then I eventually realized that I have it too. And that was like, aha, there are things that I've struggled with all my life, like depression. And also anger. I've had struggles with anger. And I had not been able to get a finger, I'd not be able to get, you know, what's the term? English is my second language, so that's my excuse. I haven't been able to get a handle on it. So. And, but the PTSD thing was really liberating. And then about 5 years ago, one of my most important mentors died, and I was plunged into a lot of grief and despair. And what I realized was he's a father figure. Like Henry Nouwen was a father figure for me. Henry Nouwen, of course, was the priest, so he was literally a father who mispronounced my name like my own father did. But this fellow was a father figure for me. And I really plunged into a depression, and it affected my family life, affected my relationship with my kids and my spouse. And I knew that I had a lot of work to do. And so I did a lot of work. I got a lot of therapy, did EMDR for a while, if you've ever heard that. And all of that seemed to help. I don't even remember now what you asked me. What did you ask me?
I don't know if it was a very clear question. I was just wondering what the process of writing through the discovery that this is what happened, and this is, you know, all of that.
Yeah, so there's a lot written about how writing can really help us move towards healing and can uncover things that we haven't necessarily been able to consciously name. So there's a lot of good literature about that. I know Glenn is aware of some of it because he's pointed me to it along the way. And also, the other thing I wanted to say was, I often compare writing to pottery. Not that I do pottery, but I have this imagination. And you put something together and you make it on the potter's wheel, and you learn something from it, but you go, no, that's not it. And you squash it down and you do it all over again. And I did that with this book many times. I worked on the book probably 8 years, and I don't know how many different drafts I've done, and I've changed the order of things and added things in and taken things out, and I kept pondering it. And in the writing, I had some very significant dreams. Some of the dreams have ended up, probably because I hang around with Glenn too much, so I get more interested in the dreams. I analyzed some of those dreams with Glenn. And another thing I did was I reread all my journals from my life. I started keeping journals when I was 14, and I read them all. Not that I was going to write a whole story of my life, but I thought, this memoir is talking about themes of my life. Maybe if I read my journals, it will reveal some things I need to pay attention to. And that's actually where the Nouwen story came. Because if you had said to me, did you visit Henry Nouwen? I could say, yeah, I visited him this time, this time, and this time, and this time. But in my journal, I had written this incident out at great length, and I read it, and I'm like, oh my goodness, that's a story that involves broken glass twice, which of course I noticed. Now I'm really into noticing glass. But also, it's a story that in so many ways unwound things that happened to me. So did anybody notice I used a certain word when I described Henry Nouwen's invitation? Did anybody notice the word I used? I used a long word. He said, the Lord be with you, and I noticed his ambidextrous invitation. Yeah. My father was ambidextrous. And so for me, that was it was kind of an unwinding. My father beat me with 2 hands, and Henry Nouwen blessed me with 2 hands. The last time my father beat me, he came out of the basement and beat me. And when Henry did this healing for me, he went to the basement and I went with him. And, you know, I'm kind of a mystic, so my wife says, yeah, you read a lot of symbolism into things. My father, one of the times he scolded me was I was playing my music way too loud in my bedroom. And what did Henry Nouwen say when he gave me a stack of CDs and his player? Play these as loud as you like, I won't mind. And I read that story and I'm like, wow, it's like God gave that to me to unwind some of the terrible things that happened in my life.
Thank you. We should bring this to a close.
Was there one other hand? Was there, did I,
Was, but it's okay.
are you okay? We can talk after too, if you want.
I just wanted to say thanks to Arthur, and I also wanted to say, just as we're closing, well, this relates to the therapy as memoir
Yeah.
as therapy. When you were writing this book, you know, we would talk.
You and I, yeah.
And sometimes, you know, as you write, it surfaces things
Yeah.
that are very
That's right.
hard to deal with. So it's good to have someone to talk to. And I just wanted to say,
Yeah.
you know, if this talk is surfacing some things for you, feel free to reach out and you can email me. We also have Jeanette Unger here, one of our ecumenical chaplains, who is a great person to talk to.
Okay.
So there's lots of support. But I really think just talking about this in a space like this is deeply healing. And I'm feeling that myself. So I just want to thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Feel free, there's books for sale. There's a little more food at the back, so feel free to mix and mingle. Thanks for coming.